Hey guys, today we're going to be delving into one of the coolest items in Dragon Ball. Though don't worry, the capsule video will be out this week, I promise. But right now, I'm doing a deep dive into the Sword of Future Trunks. Although it'll be a slightly different video because while I will speculate somewhat on where it came from, I'm mostly going to be discussing on what the closest swords on Earth are and what we can glean from its design. I have been a fan of Dragon Ball almost all my life, but I've also been a student of history for around half of my life at this point, so I have a few thoughts on it, but before we go into that, let's talk about its origins. Introduced in the 330th chapter of the original Dragon Ball manga, the sword appears alongside Future Trunks and is used to dispatch Mecha Frieza, though we need to note it was not the killing blow, as Frieza's species can survive even getting cut into little pieces, and Trunks had to obliterate a weakened Frieza afterwards with a Ki Blast. Unfortunately, this was the only real time the sword was effective in the original manga, though it is utilized to some effect in Dragon Ball Super, and certainly in the video games. It appears if someone of sufficient strength is wielding it, it is a deadly weapon, but if someone is weaker than someone else, then they can block the sword, even with their bare hands. However, I do need to note that the only person who actually blocks the sword with their bare hand is Trunks, as Goku concentrates Ki into his finger in order to block it, and Android 18 is a cyborg with skin that might be more resistant to such a weapon. Now, as we all know, in Wrath of the Dragon, Tapion grants a sword to Kid Trunks, and it alludes to being the same sword that Future Trunks uses in his timeline. But as that is a non-canon movie, I won't exactly count that right now. What is most likely the case is that the sword was either made by Bulma, as King Cold believed it was a masterfully crafted weapon, or it was created by Piccolo's materialization beam, given to Gohan, and then future Gohan gave it to Trunks. So there's not too much information on the sword beyond that, but I did want to use my historical knowledge and schooling to give a bit of speculation here. So let's take a look at the sword itself. Now, just like a lot of Toriyama's art, while the art is superb and the paneling is great, the art is usually not very consistent. Sometimes the sword blade is thick and short, other times it's thin and long. Even once I saw it shaped more like a German Langmesser than a straight blade. However, usually it is depicted as having a fairly long blade with a hilt that Trunks can wield in both hands. The scabbard is generally red or orange, whereas the grip seems to be ensconced in black leather. Okay, now if this sword was transported into our world, and I had to guess where it came from, I'd need to take notes on a few things. Firstly, we need to note that it is a two-handed cut-and-thrust sword. Oddly enough, we never see Trunks thrust with it, but it obviously has the capacity to thrust. We call that a compromised design. Something like a scimitar or a katana would be made to cut, and something like a small sword or a rapier would be made to thrust. Though of course, you could cut and thrust with all of them, but their designs are meant to emphasize one over the other. Not so with Trunks' sword. Now, Europe was not the only place with straight-bladed cut-and-thrust swords. We found them in North Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. We found them in the Ottoman Empire, China throughout its history, like the Xi'an sword, which has been used since the 7th century BC. The Romans used them. Even the Japanese had straight blades before the 10th century, when the more curved designs of the tachi and later the katana, of course, came into popularity. However, regardless of all that, it does appear this sword is vaguely European in design. Now, that line you see running through the center of the blade is a fuller, and though Toriyama has simplified it to be a simple line, generally it would be at least two lines, and between them would be an indention in the iron or steel, which helps lighten the blade weight, and also makes it stiffer so the blade is not so prone to bend so easily. And as the fuller ends, it splits into a unique but fairly basic triangle design, a little bit past the weak of the blade, or the foible. Now, while it's a basic design, you actually very rarely see that in real life. It's usually seen in fictional swords. I can think of it being in, like, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, right? But we can look past that for a second. Now, if I were to look at Ewart Oakenshott's typology, if you don't know what that is, that's pretty much the Bible for swords. They've made a few advancements since he made it, like back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I forget exactly the decade that he made it, but it's fairly old now. But even still today, it's pivotal in learning about swords. If you look at that typology, Hewitt Oakenshott's typology, I would say it's a Type 13A sword, or at least it's the closest one to that, which means it's probably from the late 1200s, maybe early 1300s. Yet if we go back to the crossguard, the quillons curve upwards a bit into knobbed ends, looking somewhat like a cross between what we call a Style 4 and a Style 11 crossguard. Now, if we look at the pommel, though, which is hard to do because most of the time Toriyama has it covered by the hands or something else, the closest type we have to our world are the mushroom or tea cozy pommels that were popular during the Viking Age, particularly used by the Vikings or the Scandinavians. So really, the sword is super cool, but it seems like it has a somewhat odd blade from the 13th century, a pommel from the 10th century, and a crossguard from the early 15th century, which makes it very odd. However, it's not impossible. There's plenty of swords in the medieval age that were refurbished with later designs as the centuries went by, even though this kind of sword would be super rare. But hey, I figured you guys would get a kick out of me using my history studies alongside this neat Dragon Ball item. So yeah, we got a cut and thrust longsword here, with a crossguard I think seems more comfortable for a one-handed arming sword, just sort of made larger. Coolio. Okay guys, hope you found that enjoyable. I have also posted my video on character writing and story structure on my other channel. Link is in the description below. And so is the channel's Patreon. I am hoping for at least a few more patrons before the end of the month, but don't feel guilty if you can't. I know people are buying presents and doing all sorts of things this month. I'm just saying, if you got some spare chains, I'd really appreciate it. As always, thanks for your likes and comments and subs, and I'll see you guys next time.